Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show of this week. We've got one next week, and then I'm off for a few days doing some touring with Dr. Philip Blood. Nick Sarantakes joins me now to talk about the Battle of Manila. It's based on his new book, Poisoned Victory, the Battle of Manila, Poisoned Victory in the Pacific. His study focuses especially on the U.S. Army's steep urban warfare learning curve in the Philippines broadly, and also the use of Filipino guerrillas and intelligence and things like that, and combined arms. And as we often discuss in this channel, I think the whole of World War II is basically the quest to try and work out combined arms. I can't wait to bring him in. Good afternoon, Nick. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, I mean, Manila, staggering casualties in the urban warfare there, which in some ways, the human tragedy, and James Scott, who you reference in your PowerPoint that we'll bring up soon, talks about the human tragedy of Manila. Does that mean in some ways the military analysis has been playing sort of second fiddle to that human tragedy for 80 odd years?
Basically, and one of the there's a lot of human tragedy, a lot of casualties if you're Filipino.
Yeah.
Most of the Japanese defenders die, so there's a lot of casualties there. Now, for a variety of reasons that I'll mention, the Japanese don't like talking about this, and there's almost nothing written on this in Japanese. There has been some stuff in English, but large parts of the Pacific War kind of get ignored. And it's dangerous to say nothing is but with a topic like World War II, it's dangerous to say nothing's been done on it, but compared to the Battle of Midway or the Battle of Stalingrad, Manila has seen very, very little. So, I think you could reasonably say a handful of books. Literally, you could probably hold them in your hands. So 8, 9, 10 books, that would be about it.
I mean, we can talk about later on. I think it's also that we've discussed it a lot on this channel. As you get into 1945, people have just got war fatigue, and everyone just wants the war to be over. And I think people, in a sense, even today, 80 years on, they want to read the books about the middle of the war when it was all still in the balance. And it's a phrase I particularly hate, but people talk about 1945 as just the mopping up, which I just absolutely makes me physically sick hearing that comment when you talk about something like the Philippines. But we'll bring up your slides, and folks, if you have questions, please fire away anything about the on the slides there. But I'm looking forward to my guests' take on this. So I'm in charge of the slides, so tell me when you want me to nudge them on. But we are talking about the Battle for Manila.
All right. Well, the first slide is a display of the U.S. Army units that fight inside the city of Manila. So starting on the left, the yellow patch with the horse's head, that's the 1st Cavalry Division, which at the start of the war was actually a cavalry division. And then they lose their horses. Now, they like to argue that they are dismounted cavalry, and that's a bit of a strain, but there's an element of truth to it. But for a more accurate description of them would be light infantry. 11th Airborne, which does an airborne drop in this campaign, is another light infantry division. The big red dot is the 37th Infantry Division, which was a National Guard unit. And the National Guard was made up of weekend warriors, reservists, guardsmen, etc., and was generally perceived, fairly or unfairly, as a second tier or second class unit. I just went blank on what that is. The one next to the 37th is the 14th Infantry Corps. That was the command that had most control over the battle. And then the green patch with the red A is the 6th Army. That was commanded by a gentleman by the name of Walter Kruger. And then the 8th U.S. Army is the last patch, and that was commanded by a gentleman by the name of Robert Eichelberger. And that's an army that that's a field army that still exists to this day. It is stationed in Korea, and both my father and brother served on the general staff of that army. But in much later time periods.
Well, I can tell you that the World War II TV audience loves General Eichelberger, so any references to him will go down incredibly well. We'll move on.
So I like to be organized, so let me talk a little bit about the origins of the book. Next slide. The book came about through happenstance, and one of the things is, they say it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, in this case, it's not who you know, it's who knows you. Tim Bent, who was the editor of the book, was looking for someone to write a book on the Battle of Manila. And he reached out to Tammy Davis Biddle, and I have been in the same room with her, but I've never had a conversation with her. And we know each other by reputation. We've been at the same conferences. And she basically said she wasn't interested in doing the book, but she recommended me. Tim called me. We had a conversation. I actually had bronchitis at the time, so it was a rather difficult conversation on my part. But he said, "Are you interested in this?" And I had been thinking for a long time that I would like to write a battle history. I am a professor of strategy at the Naval War College. And you might be wondering what that is. Well, essentially that means we teach kind of an applied history course. And I was actually trained in PhD school as a diplomatic historian. And strategy is where military operations run into foreign policy and you kind of glue them together. And I was pretty comfortable with that. And I did what I did not know at the time, and I only learned about 8 years ago, was that my dissertation advisor was a former professor in this department in which I teach. He taught strategy at the Naval War College in the 70s. And I was like, wow, there's almost been someone guiding my career path. And his name is Roger Dingman. But he kind of, I felt comfortable doing military and the diplomatic and that stuff, but I never done a pure military history. And that was a challenge that I was interested in taking on. And Tim reached out and I said, yeah, I've been kind of thinking about this in the back of my head. This is great. I want to do this. So we talked a little bit. He got a feel for me. I got a feel for him. And I signed a book contract. And away we go. Next 12 years of my life spent on writing this book. Okay, now there were some challenges to writing this book, and some of them, basically the two big ones that I expected were actually real challenges. The first one is Japanese sources. I read Japanese, not well, but I do read it. But I also knew that the Manila Naval Defense Force, which is what that says in Japanese, the Green Book. That's the title of the book. It's the Manila Naval Defense Force. And I'm just, I'm going blank on how to pronounce that. Manila Kaigun, I forget, Defense Force. The Defense Force basically stands and dies to the last man. So how do you write a battle where, everyone dies? And another problem that I faced, so Japanese sources was going to be a problem. And I knew that going in, and that turns out that was a problem. And you're also looking at, I believe, the only two books written in Japanese on the Battle of Manila. So when I said it wasn't a popular topic, it's not. And this is because of the behavior of the Japanese defenders. It's quite gruesome. It's atrocious. They commit many atrocities, and I can think of better moments in Japanese military history to study, commemorate, and all this sort of stuff. The Green Book was published in the late 60s, and what looks like a mimeograph is actually an official Japanese history of the defense of Manila. And it's actually kind of got a security clearance on it. I got it through slightly nefarious ways. It's not, anyway. What's funny about it is most of their sources are actually the official U.S. Army Green Book histories. But Japanese sources turned out to be a problem. And one of the ways around that was looking at military intelligence unit files in those divisions that I showed you at the beginning. And what happened is they took a fair number of prisoners of war. Now, there's this great perception, because it's more or less true, that very few Japanese or almost no Japanese became prisoners, except they did towards the end of the war when they could tell writing was on the handwall or writing was on the wall. And they took about 400 or so prisoners of war during the battle. And the military intelligence units basically did debriefings of these soldiers. And oftentimes this was very good intelligence that would tell you there's an artillery tube or there's a machine gun nest at the corner of Taft Avenue and Pennsylvania Street. And they could avoid that, or they could drop some ordnance on top of it or whatever. And then they would give you backgrounds of the soldiers. And these were kind of mini bio sketches that were about a page and a half long. One was about 17 pages long, and that was a guy who was just angry. He was like 45 years old. He'd actually been born in the United States. He was a businessman, and he was forced to join the Japanese Navy basically at gunpoint. And he's like, what the hell am I doing in the Navy? I'm 45 years old. And they said, congratulations, you're the oldest ensign in the Japanese Navy, or lieutenant or something like that. But very old people serving in very junior ranks. And he's like, I'm out. I'm not buying into this Bushido nonsense. Another thing that the military intelligence units did is they took documents off dead bodies, diaries, orders, stuff like that. And they translated this stuff, and it's been sitting in their files. So those were two sources of Japanese information, or the Japanese perspective, that I ended up using. The other thing that I used is the official Japanese histories of the war. There are 82 volumes in the official Japanese history, and they're written in a very old style of Japanese. And I spent a lot of time being very confounded. And essentially, I guess the best comparison is it's kind of like the difference between Shakespearean English and modern English. And I was like, why did they say that? Because sometimes they'd say the Battle of Manila in the city urban districts. And I was like, well, why do you have to have a kanji that says city and then another one that says urban districts? Anyway, my Japanese isn't good enough to figure out the differences between an older style Japanese. But I could basically look and say, okay, I want to look at page 470 and 471. And then I had Japanese students here at the Naval War College, commanders, captains, people whose English is much better than my Japanese. And I could say, can you please tell me what this says? And he says, oh, that's a telegram, Nick. And I said, I know that, but what is it telling him to do? And it's like, da-da-da-da-da-da. And I said, okay. And I got one of my students to translate about 30 pages of the official history. And for him, it was easy. I mean, it was just do-do-do-do-do-do. So, and I didn't ask, the official histories are very big, 800-page documents. So I couldn't ask him to translate everything. And when I say official history, one of the big differences between an official history in the English-speaking world, be it the U.S. Army history or the British history or the Australian history, is they're actually narratives. You actually have people who've written a text, who've got an official position on this controversy or that controversy. Well, for the most part, the Japanese official histories are basically a collection of documents. And they basically read, the general wrote a memo, and then there's the memo. And then the admiral responded with a letter, and then there's the letter. And then another sentence connects this and saying, there was obviously a disagreement, and they decided to have a conference. And then there's the memorandum of the conversation. So for most part, the official histories are a collection of documents rather than narratives of the engagement. So that turned out to be very helpful because I wasn't getting, I was getting the primary source material, and they had like telegrams that or radio messages that had gotten back to Tokyo and so forth and so on. So it gave me more insight into the Japanese side of the battle. Now, if you're going to read this, I want to warn you, it's a great book. It's brilliant. It'll make you all, smarter and sexier. But the Japanese side of the story is much smaller than the American side. So there are American and Filipino and Japanese perspectives, but I did as much as I think was reasonable to expect, but it's still the smaller side. And of course, many Japanese don't survive this. Most of the defenders do not survive, but a good number of them do survive. Not only do you have 400 POWs taken prisoner, but you have about 10-15% make it back to Japan after the war. And I actually think the number who got out of Manila was actually much higher than that, because I suspect many of those individuals who got out of the city were later killed in other parts of the Luzon campaign. But none of them have really written memoirs. So that's why these two books are pretty much the only two published books in Japanese on the battle. And another problem that I suspected would be a problem, and was the quality of map making that is now available to people. There are plenty of maps, and sometimes they were amazingly detailed. And I actually have a wall map that I don't know what happened to it, but I had it, that you would put on the wall, and it would tell you this building is made out of wood, blah, 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 blah. And that was great, and that helped me understand what was going on. But you can't take a 6 foot by 4 foot poster and put it in a book with any kind of fidelity to the original imagery. And there were some very detailed maps in the official Army history, but again, far too detailed than what I suspect readers want. So this is an example. That was a problem. My brother-in-law writes books too, and he's very successful in that. And he basically recommended his map maker to me. So what you're looking at there is basically a pretty detailed map that I got, and then I basically kind of gave directions to the map maker what I wanted, and that's kind of that is what it turned out to be, and that's actually a map that's in the book.
And Tonit, who's one of our Filipino viewers, he can see where he lives on that map, so that's good.
That's awesome. All right, next slide, please. Okay, while I was writing this book, this gentleman, James M. Scott, published his book, and it's on the Battle of Manila. And I was like, oh, gosh, darn, gee, and other words that I probably shouldn't repeat. And it's a wonderfully written book. Scott is a gifted writer, no question about that. However, after reading it, I was like, okay, we're writing two very different books. Basically, if you look at this book has what appears to be a very strong thesis that's expressed by the title of the book. And basically, my argument is Yamashita was a non-factor in the battle. And I really am not convinced by his efforts to turn General Yamashita into a key figure in this battle. Yamashita had no real influence on the outcome of the battle. And MacArthur actually seems to be very much in the background in this battle. So is this some kind of ego contest between MacArthur and Yamashita, as his title implies? No. And what he spends a great deal of time talking about is the human costs of the battle. Mm-hmm. And that's in my book. It would be misleading and inaccurate if you don't talk about what happened to the civilians, because there are people who get caught in between. But much more of his book is about the civilians getting caught and suffering. In fact, I'd say that's the main focus of the book, whereas my book focuses more on military operations and how you fight a battle in a city, and then what are the impacts of doing that. And some of those impacts are bad for the Filipinos, but some of them are bad for the U.S. Army as well. And I'll get into that in a minute. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the organization of the book. Okay, there are 21 chapters. 2 of them look at the strategic level of the war, and I try and look at how things look for the United States and how they look for Japan. There are 15 chapters that look at operational and tactical levels, and that's mostly from the U.S. side, although I do make an effort to look at what the Japanese are doing, as I mentioned. There are two chapters where I basically say, what is it like to be behind U.S. lines? What is it like to be behind Japanese lines? And the long story made short is it's better to be behind the U.S. lines rather than the Japanese lines. But, and this is an important but, you are still getting shot at if you're behind U.S. lines. So one of the things I wanted to do is, what are the military police doing? What are the quartermaster units doing? What are the medical units doing? And they're doing their job, but they're also getting shot at by Japanese soldiers who get trapped behind, or stragglers or whatever. I also looked at what happened to the Filipinos in both chapters. And again, better off being behind American lines than Japanese lines. All right. What are some of the unique features of this? Well, I did research in 18 different archives, both in the United States and in the Philippines. I got the papers of almost all the commanding generals, only 2 of the 3 division commanders, the corps commander, both field army commanders, and MacArthur, the theater commander. I did not get the papers of General Mudge, who was the commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, because I don't believe he left any behind. So anyway.
Fair enough. Yep.
There's a big theme about the influence of military media relations, and that's a reoccurring feature in urban battles. And I ended up looking at 61 newspapers or magazines, looking at how the war was reported back in the United States. And that created some problems for many of the journalists, because they essentially announced the battle was over on the first day. And then MacArthur's press releases start saying about, well, intense mopping up operations continued inside the city. And I was like, only at kind of like the 30,000 foot level is that accurate. But yeah, it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth. I used the official histories of the Army wrote, and of course the Japanese wrote, used the military intelligence documents that I talked about. And I also made an effort to get the personal papers of individual soldiers. 2 of them that people might recognize are Rod Serling, the actor and television producer, writer, etc., best known as being the narrator of The Twilight Zone, and then the novelist Norman Mailer, so who actually never got into the city, but was shot at nonetheless. Okay, next chapter, please. All right, let's look a little at the actual battle. And there we go. First off, these are the gentlemen who command the battle. Obviously, the guy probably everyone recognizes is Douglas MacArthur in the center there. The gentleman standing next to him is Vern Mudge, who is the division commander of the 1st Cavalry Division. Interesting in a lot of different ways. He actually graduates from the University of Florida before he gets accepted to West Point. So he basically goes and repeats his undergraduate college experience again. He also does a lot of stupid things during the battle. And at points, he's basically a platoon sergeant. And there's something to be said for leadership by example, but there's also something to be said that you don't need a 58-year-old 2-star doing the job of a 19-year-old sergeant.
Oh, echoes of General Urquhart. Sorry, echoes of General
Yep.
Urquhart at Arnhem. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And he actually ends up getting severely wounded about 2 weeks after the battle. He's so close to the front lines that a Japanese grenade bounces off his chest and hooks onto his pistol and then explodes and basically tears apart his hip. And that leads to his medical retirement. And then he basically goes and becomes a staffer for the Senate Armed Services Committee, and is actually working for them during the MacArthur hearings in the Korean War. Becomes chief of staff, but dies in 55 from complications of his wound. So the gentleman to the upper left, wearing the pink and greens, looking straight into the photograph, is General Robert Beitler. He is the commanding general of 37th Infantry Division. He is the only National Guard officer during the war who retains command of his unit throughout the war. And the perception, as I mentioned earlier, is that the National Guard, weekend warriors, they're not very serious about this. What I found going through this is they were really, really good. So that's a testimony to Beitler's professionalism, the quality of training, etc. The gentleman below him is Oscar Griswold. He was the Corps commander, and he is probably the person most responsible for offering the operational and strategic guidance for the battle. One of the things I make clear in the book is MacArthur basically was absent for most of this battle. He gave very little guidance, and so did Walter Kruger, the commander of the 6th Army. And Griswold was kind of knew it was being put on him, and he kind of resented it. And he made some pretty good decisions, but some of them were not the best, but that wasn't his fault because he didn't have some of the higher level information that MacArthur did. And then finally, the person to the right is General Joseph M. Swing, the commanding general of the 11th Airborne Division. And he actually leads the assault. There's an airborne drop on southern Luzon that marches up on Manila from the south. So, and he was another guy who believed in leadership by example, and he'd make his guys run, even as staff officers. And it's like, I'm going to do this, and I can finish it, and you guys are 8 years younger than me, so you better finish it. Okay, that's good, but staff officers, what are they supposed to be doing? And yes, they're going to have some physical endurance because in combat there's a lot of stress, and being physically in shape allows you to deal with that better. But do you need, the quartermaster officer, do you need him to be able to do 10 one-handed pull-ups? Anyway, so next slide, please. Okay, the gentleman there in the Time magazine, Walter Kruger, 6th Army commander, interesting. He is the primary strategic commander for the Battle of Manila and gives Griswold almost no guidance. What little guidance he does offer is good, but Griswold is like, what do I need to be doing here? And Kruger's not telling him. There was a big feud between MacArthur and Kruger before the battle. MacArthur wants to move fast, and Kruger doesn't have a problem with that, but he's worried about gaps opening up in his lines. And MacArthur says, don't worry about that. We have air superiority, so we'll let air power cover the gaps. Well, Kruger looks at this, and he sees a force of Japanese inside the city defending Manila. And then there's a great big field army in the northwest of Manila. This is actually under the command of General Yamashita. And Walt Kruger is saying, you want me to put the 6th Army between this Japanese force and that Japanese force. And to him, it looks like a hammer and an anvil. So he moves very slowly, much slower than what MacArthur wants. And MacArthur tries to push him in a number of different ways. What's interesting about this is essentially a forecasting of what happens in Korea 4.5 years later. He's one of the things he does is he grabs Robert Eichelberger, and he basically, these two generals don't like each other. Eichelberger's the commander of 8th Army, and he says, well, you do an invasion from the south. The 6th Army is coming down from the north, and whoever gets to Manila first gets to Manila. So this is an effort to play one commander off another. There is, he's kind of divided command, which is what he does in Korea. And he has an acrimonious relationship with Kruger. Again, that's pretty much what happens in Korea. Another person, the photograph person, is Richard Sutherland, who was MacArthur's chief of staff. And at this point in time, he just bails, and that's the only way to describe it. He bugs out, and he goes back to Australia because he was having an affair with a married woman. She was married, he was married, and apparently he just, missed her, wanted to get it on, etc. And he was absent, and his absence at this key juncture allowed poor planning to get accepted, and he didn't moderate between Eichelberger and Kruger, and some plans that were less than sufficient got through, and people didn't really stop and think about what's the next step. Basically classic planning moves. He was very good at asking pointed questions to staff officers and so forth. So anyway, this was not good for Sutherland's career, by the way. In fact, for a lot of reasons. So his military career comes to a pretty quick halt in 1945. Now, one of the things that MacArthur does is he basically goes to the 1st Cavalry Division and says, get to Manila as fast as you can. And General Mudge creates a flying column, which is a little more glamorous than the name suggests, but it's basically about a brigade's worth of soldiers and jeeps and tanks driving down into Manila. And there's been debate about why he does this, and the answer basically is, or why MacArthur authorizes only one column to advance on Manila. And the answer is basically there wasn't a whole lot of mechanization available to the Army on Luzon at the time because of problems they were having unloading material on the beachheads. They didn't have a major port. 37th Infantry Division was a foot unit. MacArthur tells Beitler, who he's known for a while, and says, listen, I'm giving the 1st Cavalry Division the tanks and the jeeps, and they're going forward. And Beitler basically says, hell no. And the 37th gets beat, although Beitler says, no, not really, because the 1st Cavalry Division does cross the city limits first, but the 37th Infantry Division, the National Guard unit, basically runs into people who are defending the city north of the city limits. So he says the Battle of Manila started about 5 miles outside the city limits of Manila. So we got there first. And the fact that until really about 8 hours before it happens, it looks like 37th Infantry Division is going to get there first, even though they're marching on foot. So that also tells you how damn good they are.
But a quick question, Nick, about who, if anybody, was covering for Sutherland at MacArthur's headquarters. And Terry says, was it Chamberlain?
MacArthur had a very difficult time. Chamberlain was one person who was considered briefly, but he apparently wasn't a good fit. So MacArthur rolls through several people.
Thank you. Back to you.
All right, next slide, please. All right. A lot of the literature on Manila, a lot of the memoir literature at least, focuses far too much on this facility. This is the Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas. It is a very old university located in Manila. It is still there. And during the war, it is turned into a civilian internment camp, which is a polite way or a legal way of saying POW camp for civilians. They're not prisoners of war, but so all the pre-war Americans, Britons, anyone who belongs to a nation at war with Japan is inside this facility. And as you can see, there's a lot of green space. So a lot of this is turned into farmland where people are, planting carrots and beans so they can eat. The civilian internees are on the edge of starvation when the cavalry gets there and rescues them. In fact, several people die even after they're liberated because of malnutrition. And in fact, the entire island of Luzon was on the verge of starvation and famine because of poor Japanese management, administration of the Philippines. So MacArthur gives the flying column 3 instructions. Get to Santo Tomas, liberate the civilians, get to the palace, which is the official residence of the president of the Philippines, and get to the government buildings at Rizal Park. And he basically figured that would be the center of gravity or the key spots for the city of Manila. And 2 out of 3 ain't bad. They do get to Santo Tomas and liberate the civilians. It's a very powerful moment. And MacArthur goes there and finds it intense and overwhelming because there are many people he knew from before the war that have to introduce themselves because they've lost 120 pounds and they look very different. And they do get to the executive residence of the president, but they don't get to the government buildings. However, even if they had, you still would have probably had a month-long battle. But this is, there are a lot of the people who are incarcerated here write memoirs about this. So a lot of first-person accounts of the battle from the perspective of civilians. Okay, next slide. And this is what Santo Tomas looks like today. You can see, obviously, Manila's grown up around it, and the university has built a lot of new buildings, but there's still some green space, and there's a very ornate pathway. If you go back 1 slide, please. You can see the ornateness of the kind of the entrance to the main building. It's even gotten more ornate, more statues. There's an archway, etc. So okay.
Interesting that you can it's almost the highest building back pre-war, and now it's almost the lowest building.
Yeah. So now, that's just what it looks like. It's still there. I was actually, when I was in Manila, I was watching Santo Tomas basketball, and I forget who they were playing, but I was like, hey, Santo Tomas, they got a basketball team. Anyway, next slide. Okay, this is a huge, intense moment. American prisoners are obviously happy to see the soldiers. They're climbing all over the tanks. This is a joyous moment. This tank is actually commanded by Second Lieutenant Robert E. Lee IV, who is the great-grandson of the Confederate general. So next slide, please. Okay. Media coverage is really important, and these samplings kind of get at how popular, how intense the news is of Manila's liberation. It's basically presented as basically a strategic prize second only to taking Tokyo itself. So, yay, we've done it. MacArthur's done it. The Chicago Times, which is now the Chicago Sun-Times, tabloid format. You can see, that massive headline. The Los Angeles Times, that bold headline, but also an editorial cartoon and an editorial on the front page of the newspaper. And then this one from the Evening Bulletin of Philadelphia. And there were many, many more. Most of them are not included in the book for image resolution issues and some copyright issues. So, but I think these 3 get to the point that it was a battle that was covered intensely. But, if you look at the dates, how the Yanks won Manila, that's like February 3rd. And the battle doesn't end until March. And it's like, hey, guys, what the hell's going on? So, and then you get into this very awkward situation, and a lot of reporters are questioned, their professional expertise is questioned by their colleagues. So, anyway.
Interesting.
Next slide.
Thank you.
Okay, this is General Robert Eichelberger coming up from the south. And this photo is great because it really shows the city burning. The Japanese set fire to some supply dumps, trying to destroy supplies, keep them out of the hands of the Americans and ammunition, etc. And they lose control of the fires. And these engulf a large chunk of Manila. And I would say roughly about a third of the city. And this is probably where most people die in the battle. And you can tell, you can see these the clouds are going up, it's over a mile up in the air. So,
yeah. Just a compliment from Jason Giroux, who is a major in the Canadian Army, who's something of an expert on urban warfare. And he likes very much the fact you've tackled the media coverage of this, because he talks about Ortona. We had another guest talking about the Battle of Ortona in Italy in popular memory. And urban warfare, you said it yourself, seems to have this way of it's portrayed differently in the press for whatever reason. And I'm glad you brought that up. And so is he.
Thank you. Glad to please. Buy several copies of my book.
he will. I'm sure he will. To give to all his friends. Yes. In urban warfare school.
Yeah. All right. This is guys from the 37th Infantry Division. This is actual urban combat in operation. And it amazed me that this reminded me of a playground trick I used to do with my brother. Stick a helmet on a stick and, point it around the corner and draw Japanese fire. And I'm like, and this worked. And one of the reasons it worked was the Japanese defenders were not that good. Some people like to say, oh, these are well-trained, well-disciplined Japanese naval infantry. No, these were sailors who happened to be in Manila. Most of them are sailors. There are some units from the Japanese army, but these were guys whose ship got sunk and they're like, rescued and in Manila, or they ran, base facilities. Oftentimes their training amounts to, here's a rifle, here's how you load it, point it, pull the trigger. Good luck. And that ain't a whole lot of infantry training. And in fact, there are stories of Japanese soldiers being taken prisoner of war who are trying to kill themselves with grenades, but they can't kill themselves because they don't know how the grenades work. So anyway, next slide, please. This is another photo that I like because it also gets at the nature of urban combat. A lot of times when we look at a map of a city, we think, okay, you're marching down Pennsylvania Avenue or Taft Avenue. There actually is a Pennsylvania Avenue, there was at the time. You're marching down Taft Avenue and you cross Colorado Street. And then there's a machine gun nest there. Some people think that this is very clean and easy to follow. What this shows is it's not. When you're fighting inside a city, your bullets are hitting things like buildings or sidewalks or streets, and they're kicking up dust, concrete dust. And as a result, your vision gets obscured. And this gets at it. They're shooting at a Japanese machine gun nest that's not that far away, but they can't see it because it's only like about 30 yards away, but they can't see it because of all the dust. And then when you're also hitting streets or sidewalks, you're basically putting divots in them. And suddenly these things are not easy to use to advance. So as a venue or a road, they leave something to be desired. And on top of this, another thing that happens is buildings essentially melt, or collapse might be a better way of doing it. And they oftentimes collapse on top of a street, or they collapse on top of themselves. But if they collapse on top of a street, suddenly that thoroughfare is no longer useful. And then you also have great defensive fortifications. Now, it turned out the Japanese defenders were not very good, so they're not able to take advantage of this. But suddenly, landmarks like, okay, go towards Lowe's Theater and then turn left on turn left on Utah Street. Well, you can't do that if Lowe's Theater has basically burned down to the framework, and there's a lot of garbage, a lot of debris, building ruins, etc. that is on that street. So advancing becomes a challenge. Okay, next slide, please. This is a painting. It did not end up in the book, but it is it is of the 37th Infantry Division fighting in the city, and it kind of gives you an idea of how close this combat was at times. So next slide, please. Okay, these four gentlemen are the four people who won the Medal of Honor. Only one of them survives the battle. So, and that would be Sergeant Rodriguez, who is the gentleman on the upper left. He and Private Reese basically charged the Paco Railroad Station, which was a Japanese fortification. And what made this a particularly dangerous place was a lot of buildings in Manila were built in the neoclassical style that you see in Washington. So they're kind of modeled on ancient Rome and ancient Greece with the columns and stuff like this. So these buildings are made out of marble or cement. If they're made out of cement, they're steel reinforced concrete. But the thing is a lot of U.S. ordnance, including artillery tubes, will bounce off this stuff because they don't have the velocity to penetrate the density. So these are great fortifications, and these two guys charge up to the railroad station and basically spend about 2 hours just shooting about 20 yards from the Japanese defenders. And again, these Japanese defenders are not particularly skilled infantrymen, and there are these two guys who are basically almost out in the open. They're not quite unloading, and then when they basically run out of ammunition, they say it's time for us to go. And Rodriguez gets back. Reese does not. The two gentlemen down at the bottom, Lieutenant Valle jumps on a hand grenade that he had dropped and saves his men from getting killed. And then Private Perez basically charges part of the southern defenses in the city of Manila. Look like a World War I battlefield from the Western Front, trenches, etc. He basically gets up, charges out into no man's land, and it's like there's a guy on steroids and or a lot of Red Bull energy drinks. He's killing about 20 Japanese defenders, and he basically breaks the Japanese resistance. It's an incredible story. He runs out of ammunition. He starts using his gun as a club, or his rifle as a club, and then he grabs Japanese weapons, and it's like, okay, he survives that, but is killed a few weeks later, actually just outside Manila. And actually, he knows he's getting the Medal of Honor, but he doesn't get it before he dies.
Tragic.
All right. General Post Office. This building is still in Manila. You can see the neoclassical style there. This should have held out for a long, long time. The backside of it is the Pasig River, so there is no way to get at it from the other side. And it is at the end of a park. And in 1945, that is burned off. All the trees are gone. There's actually some barbed wire there. You can see how big it is. The Japanese have about, if memory serves me, a company worth of defenders, which was probably a little too not enough. But anyway, the 37th Infantry Division attacks, and they basically take the post office in a day. And this really, if the Japanese had been smart about it, because they have the fortifications, they have sandbags inside rooms, they have a high ground. There's nowhere for the Americans to hide when they're advancing on the post office. They should have been able to take dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of Americans with them, and they don't. They basically surrender. Well, they don't surrender it, but the building is taken from them rather quickly. And this is important because.
So is that a failure of the Japanese organization of the defense? Is there even a plan for the Japanese organization? I remember being in Budapest in Hungary, and the Germans there had a series of strategic buildings they identified that were kind of the central centers of sort of hedgehog type defense positions. Is there nothing like that going on here?
The short answer to your question is it's a failure of strategy and it's a failure of tactics. Right. Only in one location, like they basically treat these buildings as strong points. So they put people there. They don't have enough people there, but it's on its own. So you're not getting any supporting fire from the city hall, which is not too far away. The walled city, Intramuros, which the Spanish built when they conquered the Philippines, it's not that far away. I mean, when I say I'm talking like less than a quarter mile. I mean, these things are within, machine gun range of supporting one another. So instead of making it a network, they make it strong points. And you only see a network really towards the end. And I think this reflects a lack of, a lot of lack of Japanese understanding of how to do this, because most of these guys, even the senior commanders, are naval officers who are, trying to do something that they're not trained to do.
Thank you. Moving on.
Yep. Okay, that's the post office from the other side, and you can see that there ain't a whole lot of place for you to go. And actually, ironically, if you look at the north end, which is on the left, there was a fire at the post office a few years ago, and this was taken right after it. So they've rebuilt it since, but this gets you an idea of why this is important. It's right there on the river. Yeah. And anyway, another image of the post office. And this gets at why there's very little places to hide when you're attacking it. And most of that shrubbery and those trees are gone. They've been blown up, burned up, etc.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the Japanese and the Filipinos. Next slide.
Yeah. There we go.
All right. A lot of this I've kind of mentioned, so I'll kind of go through it rather quickly. Luzon and the city of Manila are on the verge of famine. That's because of poor Japanese administration, and that's accumulation of 3 years worth of stuff. It's not that the Japanese are mean and cruel. There's an argument to be made they are, but this is mainly because they're not getting a whole lot of advantage out of controlling the Philippines for their empire. It's an economic deficit. It takes a long time to exploit the resources, etc. Admiral Iwabuchi Sanji is the person most responsible for the defense of the Manila. And he basically says, if they're not on our side, they're against us. So you can treat the Filipinos as guerrillas, kill everyone you want, which was an insanely stupid order. There are a lot of ethical and moral problems with that, which are pretty obvious to everyone. But it's also a really bad military order because you don't have the resources to kill 1 million people. Yeah. You don't have the bullets. And oh, by the way, the other problem with this is it takes you away from fighting the Americans, who you should be shooting at. It does tell you, though, that, as I mentioned earlier, it's better to be on the other side of the front lines, and to some degree you have to put front lines in air quotes, than it is to be on the Japanese side. Okay, the Japanese, I've spent a lot of time talking about this. They spend a great deal of time building the defenses. Most of them are aimed at or positioned to defend against a force coming from the south. And actually, the 11th Airborne Division, which is trying to take the airport, does encounter a really difficult time because they are actually coming up against the defenses that were designed properly, if you will. The defenses are not done well. In fact, and one of the things I did is I looked at engineer units. What are they doing? And the answer is they're trying to clear debris, clear minefields they're getting shot at. What was interesting is they dropped some smoke, and the Japanese couldn't see them, even though they're 30, 40 yards away, and there's nothing in between them. but smoke. But the smoke would protect the engineers, and then they'd remove minefields. And the report says these aren't very well done. These were very easy to remove. The U.S. Army essentially takes the city of Manila in about 2.5 weeks. Okay. So if you're thinking about the Battle of Berlin, the Battle of Stalingrad, this is quite rapid. Okay. And it's not, there are reasons for that. One of them is the incompetence of the Japanese defenders. That is a huge element of the story. Another thing is MacArthur really did have a lethal force. He was using surprise, speed, and maneuver to the advantage. These guys are not trained to do urban warfare, so they're having to take infantry skills that they've learned how to fight in a jungle and adapt them quickly to an urban environment. And to some degree, there are similarities. You're dealing with big structures, trees that block in a jungle environment, trees that block artillery. You have to figure out how to deal with that. But then there's some things that are quite different. Three-dimensional nature of urban warfare. You can be going underneath through the sewer system. You can be on top, jumping from building to building, or fighting inside buildings. So some of this requires learning as you go rather quickly. And the Army has the structure at that time to learn lessons quickly and spread them and share them. So that expertise can be adapted rather quickly. One of the reasons the battle takes a month, exactly a month, is because the government buildings at the end of Rizal Park take a week to liberate. And this is the one time that the Japanese basically are doing some kind of interlocking defense. So, and the Army at one point just says, this is, and I've been in these buildings, they've been rebuilt. You can see why they are difficult to defend, or why they're easy to defend and difficult to take. Again, Rizal Park, it's by this point, there's nothing left. All the trees are gone. They've been blown up. So there's nowhere to hide. The defenders can shoot at you. They can see you from 200 yards away. So it's difficult to advance. You can drop ordnance on them. But again, most artillery tubes do not have the velocity to break down. And at one point, they get very close to one of the buildings. And their efforts are made to enter the buildings. They have very wide halls that have been turned into defensive fortifications with sandbags, etc. There are repeated efforts. You get inside the building, but then the defense kicks the Americans out. So at one point, out of just frustration, you get artillery and you surround one of these buildings and they just start shooting at the ground floor, trying to take out all the columns and supports. And eventually the building collapses in on itself. And yay, you took one building, except the guys in the basement are still fighting. So anyway, that takes a week, and that adds on to the 2.5 weeks that it takes to take the entire city. So for that last week, most of Manila is secured, but there's still a lot of shooting going on in a fairly small piece of real estate. It's just 3 buildings separated by 2-lane roads, so it's not particularly big. Again, on the atrocities, I talk about them. I don't wallow in them, but not to talk about them would be disingenuous. It would be cowardly. It's a major feature of the battle. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, what impact did the Battle of Manila have? Slide. Well, why does it go so fast? Well, part of this is because it needs to go fast. There's a realization that Manila and Luzon are on the verge of famine, and that the Japanese are committing atrocities. Okay, so that's good. Now, you take the city in a month. Great. Okay, but strategic effects of operations are really what determines whether a battle is important or not. Why do we spend all this time talking about Stalingrad? Why do we spend all this time talking about Gettysburg in a different war? Okay, well, there are reasons for that, because they have outsized effect. The Battle of Manila has an effect that is very bad for the United States. So the size of the battle is not important. It's how it changes things. And what makes Manila bad for the United States is what makes Manila valuable has been destroyed.
Right.
You need Manila to invade Japan. You need a port city. You need docks. You need warehouses to store supplies. You need places to tie up the ships so you can load them. All of that has been destroyed, partly by the fire, but partly by U.S. artillery. So, and partly by Japanese defense. Those are the things that suddenly turn this into a negative victory, a poisoned victory. And in addition to this, you've got almost 1 million people, about 2/3 of whom do not have a place to live. Okay. The only thing that you have going for yourself is that the water supply has survived. And that's the one thing that General Kruger does that's worthwhile is he tells some of his units to get to the dams that basically feed or supply the water to the city, the lakes, the reservoirs, secure those. If you don't have a running water supply system, then you're probably going to have a massive public health crisis within a few days. I mean, 2-3 days. As it is, you still have a big public health crisis because you have to dispose of a lot of dead bodies. And that simply is beyond what the U.S. Army had prepared itself for. And you have to take care of the Japanese dead, even if you don't have a lot of respect for them, because they're a public health hazard. So, and the Army just was not ready for that. And they weren't ready for being, hey, the Manila needs a police force. Who's going to do that? The MPs? I got like 150 of them. That's not enough. Where's the Manila police force? Well, where everyone else is, So there are efforts to repair the city quickly, but the 37th Infantry Division is tasked with this, and it's almost beyond their capacity. Okay. The only reason the United States survives this is that I shouldn't say the only reason it survives, but the reason this is not as catastrophic as it could be is that the war does not last much longer. The war is over in about 6 months, and you don't have to invade Japan. So all the problems that Manila is starting to pose are not problems. But you're having to invest enormous amount of engineering assets in Manila just to repair and get the things that you need. And one of the other things that the Japanese did, and this they actually knew what they were doing, is they dropped a lot of wrecks or hulks in Manila Bay. And they put them, according to the Commodore, the Navy one-star who oversaw the recovery operation, they put them in the exact perfect spot. So they're going in and they're saying, we got these ships, we got to cut them in half, cut them in thirds. Let's send, guys down with welding arc torches and all this sort of stuff. But because of current patterns, because of mud, sunlight, you can only keep these guys down there for about 3 or 4 hours before everything turns on you. It turns out these guys are getting skin rashes, skin diseases if they stay down much longer. So it takes forever and a day to get Manila back to what it was as a port facility. And there's a stunt. They get one ship within like about 3 weeks, but that was one ship. You need hundreds of ships to be able to use Manila for it to be effective, and that doesn't happen. Okay, next slide.
That's the last one on that one.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
So we've got some questions for you, Nick, which I knew there would be, and some praise. Tonit, who is on your map, as you mentioned earlier. I need this book, not very many detailed operational tactical books in the Battle of Manila. Most accounts just describe chaos. Now, Jason, who is our Canadian urban warfare, he talks about the river. He says, due to the Japanese destroying bridges across the Pasig River, the Americans do have to use watercraft to cross. Is that aspect of the river crossings? Because I think the cover, the photos on the cover of your book is of the river crossing, isn't it? I think, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah, the cover on the book is of, it's actually taken with the intramuros behind the photographer, and you're looking out across the Pasig River, and it's just after the U.S. Army has breached, and I think it's I think it's the 147th Infantry Regiment. It's 37th Infantry Division. But yeah, it's looking at northern Manila, which is more not damaged than the central Manila. But yes, bridges are a target of Japanese raiders during the battle. And at some point, you have to have ferries, you have landing craft doing ferry work, and these are targeted. That's in the book. Yes, that's very much there.
Thank you. Well, next one I'm going to, where are we? Jason is also talking about, he's answering questions in the sidebar from viewers about what experience the US Army has of urban warfare, and saying that in the ETO, about 40%. We've also got Dr. Philip Blood in the sidebar, who is an expert on the urban warfare in the German city of Aachen. So the thing that we've discussed on this channel a lot is that information from one theater doesn't always make its way to people in other theaters. You know, John Curatola, who you've been on stage with, talks about the big preparation, the ETO, for having to eventually cross the Rhine. And where, you know, from the landings in Normandy, from the landings in the south of France, everyone knows eventually you're going to have to cross that Rhine to get to Germany. How much, if any, anticipation had there been in the US Army that you will eventually have to take out these large urban areas in the Philippines, and any preparation for that?
I think I see very little. I think it's they have to learn on the fly. MacArthur generally believed that he was going to win this battle without fighting. Right. And one of the things he does, it's quite clever, and there's a reason why he has, a number of stars. So they've taken Leyte, which is an island to the south of Luzon, and Luzon is basically the big island. It's also the northernmost island, the northernmost big island. And instead of invading southern Luzon from Leyte, which would, basically going up from Australia, which would make sense, he goes around and then comes down and invades from the north. So that's one of the things that, in an operational sense, in a strategic sense, it's great, because all the Japanese defenders all their positions are facing south. And then, he's basically move, speed. And he's got an argument. A lot of this, one of the reasons he's able to take a lot of territory is because he does hit with speed, surprise, maneuver. So, but I think he's expecting basically they'll just roll up the Japanese. In fact, one of the things that happens is in his staff, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, people made too much out of it, but they spend several days planning a victory parade in Manila. And the thing is people, like, there's a reporter who goes, "You guys don't understand. There's a urban battle taking place, and MacArthur's headquarters is about 60 miles away from the city. You don't understand this." And at first they're like, "What's wrong with this dude? Why is he being so intense?" And then suddenly it's like, we got a problem here. So at least at a theater level, there was an expectation that Manila would basically fall fairly easily. And in fact, most of Luzon would fall fairly easily because they've already defeated the Japanese in Leyte. That's not exactly how it works out. There are still battles. They do tend to be fairly lopsided, but no, there isn't a lot of planning or training. One of the amazing things about the history of the U.S. Army in this conflict is that you're fighting in Europe. Well, actually, you fight in North Africa, desert fighting. Then you go to Europe, you fight a different type of war there. And at the same time, you're fighting basically in, Central Pacific, Southwest Pacific, and you're fighting on a lot of basically jungle islands or in jungle terrain, and there's a great deal of adaptability. The learning curve is pretty fast. And that is probably one of the great it's not sexy to talk about learning curves, but that is one of the great things that makes the U.S. Army so adaptable. And it's also something that the British Army has to deal with too. And the British Army goes through a much faster learning curve than they do in the First World War. And that's a reason why they keep their casualties relatively low compared to the First World War. So that ability to learn quickly is a great skill. And we all tend to say, "Ooh, look at the Germans! Look what they did to Poland! Look what they did to France in 1940." Okay, great, but the Germans make a lot of bad strategic mistakes, and they overextend their army, as good as it was, and they also show clear limits. Yeah, they're great at tactics, but the other higher levels of war, not so much. So,
Yeah.
and that's where the U.S. Army in particular starts doing some really good things.
I mean, this is where, I mean, we've talked about this before, that by 44, 45, the Allies generally are quite good at the basics of soldiering. There had been some false dawns earlier in the war, but the basic kind of adaptability of platoon and company tactics, it's working now. And with those sort of building blocks, whether you're facing heavy forests or desert or urban warfare, those basic building blocks will to some extent kind of be universal, and then you can build on that, and there's a professionalism. We have another particular question, well, two questions. One about, you talked about the fact that the city is destroyed. People talking about Richard Frank's work and the possibility of it being base X. You said that obviously that the war takes a different course, atomic bombs, etc. 6 months later, but with the destruction of the city, before they know how the war is going to pan out, had there been any kind of contingency plan to have a base somewhere else, or I don't know, you use artificial harbors or use a different part of the Philippines or something else? Had there been any thought to, oh dear, we've destroyed the city, what are we going to do next?
I think the short answer to that question is no. The longer-winded answer is sort of, I mean, you're trying to develop Okinawa. Okinawa has its port facilities aren't great, but it's a fairly big island. It's about the size of the U.S. state of Rhode Island. So but you can only use about half of Rhode Island. The northern half is pretty mountainous and not very, very useful. So you can do some stuff off Guam, use some artificial harbors, you try to repair Manila. But one of the problems that you have in 1945 is you're running out of steam. And Mark Galicchio and Waldo Heinrichs wrote a book called, I just went blank on the name, Implacable Foes. And basically the argument that they're making, and that I see and more or less confirm in my book, is that you're at what Karl von Clausewitz called the culmination point. You're running out of manpower. You're running the logistics, which has been so great for the United States to supply basically two separate wars at the same time, is finally reaching its limits. One of the big problems you're having is the further you go through the Pacific, the more cargo lift, more merchant lift you need. So it's one thing to take Guam or Tinian, but when you want to invade Japan, which is fairly big, I have a map that I superimposed at Japan on the United States, and it goes from Alabama to Maine. So it's a big piece of real estate. And I also have a slide where I impose Japan on Europe, and you go from, basically southern France to Poland. So it's a big piece of real estate. You need a lot of cargo lift, and the port facilities on the West Coast simply aren't big enough to handle it. And that's coming out of the official U.S. Army history. When they're trying to do things, okay, we'll take people out of Galveston and we'll go through the Panama Canal, or we'll ship stuff out of Miami and go through the Suez Canal. But wow, you're talking about traversing almost the entire planet. And then you're running out of people. That's a big issue. And the Army is trying to figure out how you demobilize. And the problem is the war isn't over. And then this is getting to issues of like, hey, you have a point system.
People have reached the points now, haven't they? Yeah. The railroad network in the United States can't handle all this. And this is all coming out of Heinrichs and Galicchio. And one of the other things is the planners at the Pentagon have said, we need 40% of the merchant marine lift to invade Japan. The problem is you need 66% of the lift to run the civilian economy. And you see a discrepancy there of 6%. And the Pentagon guys say, well, the Americans are going to have to do more sacrificing. You've defeated Japan, you defeated Germany, and the answer is more.
maybe that's not politically realistic. So, and you start seeing things like shell shortages in MacArthur's theater. MacArthur's having a manpower problem. He's not able to replace, because of all these issues, he's not able to replace his losses and casualties. So he is getting replacements, but slowly his units are shrinking. So these are all sorts of problems that the U.S. has to face. So you're trying to find solutions to them. And it's a good thing that the war ended the way it did.
Thank you. A question about casualties. It's oft quoted that the 100,000 civilians killed during the battle. But some people, Michael and General Breitler, question where that number came from. What's your opinion, Nick, on the figure of 100,000?
Yeah, if you sit down, and I think Michael did the math, the figure comes from the official Army history. And if you do the math, that implies a killing efficiency that the Manila Naval Defense Force never had. I mean, it's just like, no. The only possibility of that is how many people were killed in the fire. But, I think I can't remember if I make up a number. And if I did, it was just a guess. But essentially, 100,000, that's roughly 10% of the city of Manila. Let's see. I mean, you do the math, the 20,000 dead Japanese, 30, 40,000 dead Filipinos. That's still a lot of dead bodies there. Yeah. I mean, the damage is horrific. The economic damage is horrific. The physical damage is horrific. 100,000 is what Mr. Smith, the author of the official Army history, made up or guessed at. Let's be generous. He made a guess, but I don't think there was any good number. It's just, but when I say there are a lot of dead people, there are stories in more than one, so I believe them, where you can smell the stink outside the city. I mean, it's like you can smell the stink 5 miles out, and it just gets worse and worse as you come in. And what is the stink? Well, it's a lot of things, but it's primarily bodies decomposing.
Yeah. No, shocking stuff. It says that it's not arguing of the casualties, but it's the horrendous loss of life is horrendous, whether it's 60,000, 70,000, or 100,000. Terry asked any particular aspect that the Filipino guerrilla units did in this battle that you think is significant. Obviously, they're helping. There's a certain amount of guiding. They're pointing out, but they're also fighting alongside. Any particular aspect of that you think is worth mentioning?
Well, the Filipino guerrilla contribution is huge, but not in this battle. They provided some intelligence, which intelligence units found not all that useful. It helped them secure some rear areas, but the fight inside the city, for the most part, is between the Americans and the Japanese.
Right.
The guerrillas are trying to get in there because obviously Manila is to the Philippines what New York is to the state of New York, or what Atlanta is to the state of Georgia. It's the tail that wags the dog. But for the most part, I didn't see a lot of military contribution from the guerrillas. With that said, the military contribution of the guerrillas is massively important throughout the Luzon campaign.
Right.
And it's massively important at the strategic level. The United States, this is my argument, and it's not in this book, but I'll make it in something else. The United States fights World War II primarily as a sea power. And people might go, what? Are you serious? Sea powers tend to be small countries, islands, peninsulas, and they have big navies and very small armies. And the United States has 8 million guys in uniform in 1945. That's not small. But 89 infantry divisions, when you look at the scale of the Pacific Theater, and you can drop the entire continental United States in MacArthur's command area and still have room to drop another continental United States in his command theater. And I have a great overlay map that makes this point. So MacArthur has 20, 30 divisions that, you're trying to take a piece of real estate that stretches from Alabama to New Hampshire and Vermont. which is to say Japan, that's a small expeditionary force on the scale of Wellington on the peninsula. So the United States is fighting primarily as a sea power. Well, what do good sea powers do? And the answer is you find allies. And the Filipino guerrillas were a massive asset at the strategic level. They're roughly, I guess, about 500,000 people who are fighting the Japanese in the Philippines. And not all of them are going to leave their village, their province. They're not going to leave their island. But that's a massive, massive advantage.
Yeah.
That's the equivalent of, 2 army groups, or about 3 to 4 field armies, World War II era field armies. That, these people want to kill Japanese. They really do.
Yeah, they don't need any motivation, do they?
Yeah. And now some of that's going to stop once you leave the Philippines, but you're still going to be able to get a lot of guys who are going to say, give me a uniform, train me, in some of these guerrilla units. There's a great diversity in the guerrilla units in the Philippines. Some of them are basically formal military units using training manuals from Fort Leavenworth and, using ranks and all this other sort of stuff. Some are just criminals, and there's a lot of in between. But this is a major asset for MacArthur, for the U.S. effort in the Philippines, and it's one of the ways to square the circle of the problem that I was talking about. Is you're starting to have people say, hey, you got to start demobilizing. We defeated Germany. Well, wait a minute. You need more troops to invade Japan. What? Where are you going to get those troops? And okay, you want the Soviets to attack Manchukuo, Korea. Got it. That'll help. I wrote a book on British contribution to the invasion of Japan. So you're going to get 3 divisions out of the Commonwealth. You're not going to say no, but you still need more. And 500,000 Filipinos is huge. So, of course, it gets into what if territory, which historians aren't really supposed to talk about. But I teach strategy, so I can do that a little. And you're going to need this asset. If this war goes on, you're going to need the Filipino manpower. So guerrillas are enormously important.
Well, brilliant stuff. I think we will leave it there, but I'm already thinking I'm going to have to invite you back to talk about something else in the future. Our learning has increased about the Battle of Manila. Everyone in the sidebar is impressed, so it's been fantastic talking to you. So, folks, the link to purchasing the book are in the description below, or you can find it wherever you buy your books. It's been great talking to you. Let's do it again.
Thank you. You don't have to ask me a second time. I spent all this time talking about a book. I love it when people want to ask me questions. So thank you. Everyone buy at least 3 copies. So
yeah, I'm sure they will.
Yeah. So no, I'm grateful. And I've done some engagements where the audience was pretty sparse. So people want to ask questions, challenge me. I'm more than willing to do it. And I got to tell you, at points writing this book was difficult because you have to live with a lot of that bad information in your head. So when people want to talk about this, it's gratifying to know that it was the journey was worth the effort.
Well, people love good research and good presentations here. So, folks, I'm back again on Monday. We're talking about the SAS Operations Wallace and Hardy into France sort of around the time of D-Day with Steve Davis, my friend. Looking forward to that one. As always, click like and subscribe and buy my guest books and read their blogs, etc. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. I will see you all on Monday. Cheers. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, viewers. Bye.
Bye, guys.